Well, hey everybody, my name's Aaron. Welcome back to the channel. I don't know if you're like me, but as a kid, I loved playing Atari games like this one. This is Enduro, and I can remember plenty of times playing this game for hours and needing to go to the bathroom in the middle of my game really bad. So what I would do is I would slow down my car and let it coast, something like this, and just kind of let it bump along and drift while I ran to the bathroom, did my business, ran back, and then hopefully picked up my game in time to complete the level and progress as you can. It's a very fun game if you haven't played it. In my 10 technical things you didn't know about the Atari 2600 video, I mentioned that there was the ability to make a pause mod so that you could actually pause the game anywhere, even if the game didn't have a built-in pause function. So today I'm going to show you how you can install a pause mod on your very own Atari 2600. It's coming up right now on the Retro Hack Shack. So before I get into the actual mod, I'm going to need a television to connect the Atari to so that we can test it out. Now, I know I could have used my Sony Trinitron that I showed in the intro, the one that I rebuilt, but I just happened to come across this one at e-waste, and I thought, you know, you can never have too many woodgrain beauties sitting around your space. And it's very typical at e-waste for them to cut the cords off so that they can better manage all the bulk of the CRTs that's coming into them. And that is the case with this one as well. So I'm hoping this is a simple fix. Just fix the cord and maybe it'll work. Unlike my Sony Trinitron with its real wood case, this one is actually all plastic with just this wood veneer kind of put on top of it. But that's okay. It'll still look great matched with a fake wood-grained Atari 2600. Now, this particular TV was manufactured in July of 1983, so cable TV was a thing, and it actually has a switch down here that will let you switch between regular VHF and UHF or some mixture of VHF, UHF, and cable channels. I was also lucky enough that this particular TV came with the antennas. Most of the time those are either broken or discarded. And it does have this little cable that attached to the coax input, and that just goes up and attaches to those antennas if you want to use those. Now, while I take this thing apart, I want to use the opportunity to tell everybody to be careful and not to work inside of a CRT cabinet if you don't know what you're doing. There are high voltages in here, and you could really end up injuring yourself from a really nasty shock. So don't do it if you don't know what you're doing, or look for someone else who's done it before that can give you some pointers and maybe work alongside you until you feel comfortable enough doing this by yourself. Now, while I was worrying about shocks, just when I got this thing open, this giant bug came out of nowhere and flew right at me, scaring me half to death. I don't know what this thing is, but it's huge. It's bigger than a hummingbird, and it just kept flying around the garage all night trying to get into the lights. But man, that did scare me there for a minute. Now that excitement was over, I was able to remove the old cord, and it was held in place with one of these grommets to keep it from getting yanked out by mistake. So I'll need to find another cable that fits into this so I can reuse it. After finding a cable the appropriate width, I was able to go ahead and solder that into place on the board, paying close attention to the connections for where the neutral and hot wires were before. It shouldn't make too much difference on this particular TV since it's not a hot chassis type of TV, but it's always a good practice anyway. So after getting everything connected and plugging it in, it's time to fire it up. And here we go. Okay, well that's something. Let's get it on the right channel here, and there we go. There's ET. So not bad. We'll need to do a little bit of color correction and play with the brightness and contrast. I was actually able to get this thing pretty close to where I wanted it, although I couldn't get it all the way because it doesn't have all the controls I need to do that. But comparing it with this other TV, it looks pretty good, so I think we can move forward with this one. The pink Sony Trinitron is a later TV that has a darker phosphor mask, which provides greater contrast, so it's always going to look better. But this did give me an opportunity to tune the colors, and even though it's a bit more washed out, this woodgrain Hitachi is going to do just fine. Not bad for just replacing a power cord. Now that I've confirmed that this thing is working, I went ahead and put the back cover on, and it was time to give it a little clean with some Windex. Ooh, look at that dirt. Now it's time to install the pause mod itself. So we start by removing all the screws on the bottom of the Atari 2600. By the way, if you're going through this process and you need some help, feel free to call Atari Super Service. Here's the numbers. If you want, you can try them out yourself and let me know in the comments who picks up the phone. We're also going to need to take off this metal plate to get to the main board. Now this shielding is actually cast aluminum, and so you might find that the screws here are a little bit difficult to get all the way out. They'll hit a point where they just kind of sit and spin. So you're either going to have to use your fingernail or a screwdriver to kind of push up on those screws as you unscrew them, and eventually they will come out. And now we can get a look at the main board with its 3 ICs here. This first one is the CPU. This is the 6507, a special modified version of the 6502, which was used in so many systems in the early days. And down here we have the television interface adapter, or TIA. I know some of you like to call it the TIA. I like to call it the TIA, so that's personal preference on my part. And then up here we have the MOS 6532, which is also known as the Riot chip, RIOT. That's RAM, IO, and timer chip. And this is where that 128 bytes of memory lives on the system. So let's start with the pause mod. Here is the mod itself. I bought this from Vintage Gaming and More. And you could do this yourself if you wanted to build it up. The instructions are online, but they had a nice little kit, came with all the components I need, and so that made it easy. So basically what we have here is some resistors, some diodes, a chip, and then a toggle switch to toggle the pause mode on and off. If you want to build cool mods like this on inexpensive PCBs, look no further than today's sponsor, PCBWay. PCBWay offers inexpensive PCB manufacturing and a whole lot more. Need assembly services? No problem. They can do front side, back side, through-hole components, you name it. They also offer 3D printing, CNC milling, and more. So check out PCBWay for your next project, and I thank them for their support of the Retro Hack Shack. And the way this works is we're going to make some modifications to the board here so that this thing can interface a signal going from the TIA chip to the CPU. It's going to intercept a signal, and when we turn the toggle on, it'll intercept that signal at just the right time, and it will essentially pause the CPU. You have to do it at a very specific time when the TIA is communicating back on a certain port to the CPU. So we're going to have to make a couple of modifications. Number one, we're going to have to take out this resistor right here. It's basically a pull-up to 5 volts for one of these pins over here on the CPU. We're going to take that out because that's where we're going to be intercepting the signal. Now, this also routes back around through the back of the board here over to the TIA to pin number 3. So not only are we going to have to take the resistor out, but we're going to have to cut this trace somewhere along here to make sure that that signal is definitely removed and not going back over to the TIA, because that's where we want to get in between. Okay, so there are actually some really good instructions over on Video Gaming and More where I bought this mod, and they have instructions for the 4-switch Atari 2600, the 6-switch, and also the Atari Junior for how to install this mod. I'm going to be doing things just a little bit differently here. I'm going to put up a side-by-side comparison of their instructions versus what I'm doing. Basically, the way that they do it is they have you cut this trace right here, which comes over to this pad where the resistor used to be. And then what they say to do is the connection that goes to the 6507, they want you to put right on the top of the pin over here. But I don't like doing that whenever I can help it. And it's messy. Sometimes you can bridge connections. If there's ever a chance to solder the wires directly to the board, I would prefer to do that. So I did things a little bit differently. So what I did was, instead of cutting the trace up here, I actually cut it down here. Right there. Maybe you can see that. That's where I use my X-Acto knife to cut through that trace. What that does is it allows me to make the connection to this pin on the 6507 from this natural pad here where the resistor used to be. So that goes up to the 6507. The connection that needs to go down to the TIA now can actually go through, I don't know if you can see it, this via down here, which I desoldered. I took the solder out of there so I can put the wire there. And what that allows you to do is keep all the connections for this particular mod on the board and not solder to the top of the pins. I also removed the plastic bridge right here. There was one like this. I removed that one there so that I could snake the wire underneath. The other connections for this particular mod are a ground. There's a ground connection right here, and then a 5-volt connection down here. Those stay the same as the instructions on Vintage Gaming and More's site, but I think this will be a cleaner implementation at the end of the day. Also, as a bonus, you might be wondering what these connections are for right here. I'm not sure I mentioned it in my 10 things you didn't know. This would have been in the 10 technical things you didn't know about the Atari 2600. So on the early versions of the 2600, there are these pins where you could put a socket and actually install a ROM here, because at one point they thought about putting a built-in game. I'm not sure which one they were considering, maybe Pong or maybe Tank, or Combat as it was later known. But they had considered putting a built-in game on the Atari 2600, and that's where the ROM for that would have gone. And I believe there's another mod where you could actually do that. You could put in this game, a game of your choice, onto a EEPROM there and put it right there. And then when you turn the power on, if there was no cartridge installed, it would default to playing that, whatever was on that particular ROM there. So yeah, pretty cool little trivia for you, little extra trivia for those Atari fans who may not be aware. Okay, so here's what the mod looks like when it's all done. You can see that this mod board here fits nicely where that ROM would go. Now, they'll have to find another place for it if you're using a smaller Atari 2600, one of the newer ones, but mine fit really nicely here. I've got ground up there. I've got the 6507 connection there. I've got 5 volts coming over there with that red wire, and then this blue wire comes all the way down underneath this socket and goes through that via to connect to the TIA. So everything is connected. I've mounted the board with some of this hook and loop double-sided tape. Hopefully you can see it there by 3M. And that provides some pretty good stickiness because it has like a gelatinous layer there next to the adhesive, and it provides good stickiness to stick to this board, and it also raises the board plenty off of the main PCB here so that it doesn't short out anything onto the board. And if I want to, it's hook and loop, so it's Velcro essentially. I can just remove this whenever I want and take it off if I want to or whatever. So yeah, this is nicely fitted and ready to go. I just need to put my TIA back in temporarily so that we can test this thing out. And I also have my pretty long wires here, and those I'll feed back up through one of these holes in the case here, and then I will route that to wherever I want to put the switch on the actual external case. Okay, here we go. First test. I've got the switch in the off position. Luckily, it's written on the side of the switch. And let's turn this on and see if the game works. I've also cleared out all the metal. You know, the screws are kind of out of the way here, just to make sure there was nothing going to short out the board since it's just resting on my wooden work surface here. So let's see what happens. Okay, well, so far so good. There's no sound because I'm getting ready to install the sound mod, so don't worry about that. So all of a sudden I'm playing my Atari and I have to go to the bathroom, so I flick the switch. With any luck, when we flick it back, it will go back to where we paused it. Yep, it did. Look at that. Let's try that again. Here he comes. I'm going to flick the switch. He actually stole my thing. That's okay. So I flick the switch, and then when I flick it back, here he goes. Continue my game and my high score for, in this case, ET or whatever game you're playing. The pause mod, it's working great. It's interesting, depending on where you stop the processor as it's processing, you get different colors on the screen, and it freaks you out at first, like thinking this isn't going to work, but sure enough, you click the switch again, you're right back in your game. That is awesome. So I was just getting ready to drill a hole in this Atari VCS, I even had my drill out all ready to go. And then I thought, you know, I can't bring myself to cut a hole in this like I would want to, which would be like maybe in between some buttons or maybe on top or the side or the back. I just can't bring myself to do it. So then I started thinking about, I wonder if there's a better way. And I think there is. So the way this works is basically one side, one of these connections goes to ground and the other one goes to the signal. And when the signal is pulled low to ground by connecting them with this switch, then it does the pause function as we saw before. And so then I thought, you know, there's almost never a time when I'm actually going to use the color black and white switch anymore. I can't imagine that I would be hooking this up to a black and white TV for any reason going forward. So why not repurpose the color switch, the color black and white TV type switch, to accomplish the pause function, and then I don't have to drill any holes, and maybe I could make this reversible if I ever wanted to bring this back to stock. Here's the back of the VCS, and here is where that color switch is. As you can see, when you throw the switch to go to black and white, it just connects ground, which is this part. I've toned this out. So it connects this ground plane here to a signal wire that's coming in from the logic board here. So what I can do actually is I've traced this out and it goes over to one of these connections over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to desolder, I think it's this yellow wire here. I'm going to desolder that from the main board, the logic board here, and pull that out. And then I'll connect that to the signal wire here so that it accomplishes the same function. So that way, when we throw the switch here, it's basically going to be doing the same thing as if we threw the switch on this toggle switch. So I got out my soldering iron and removed that yellow wire from the main board. And then I also removed the wire that was going back to ground, as we're not going to need that anymore because we're going to be reusing the ground that's already on the board underneath the TV type switch. And then I got out my crimping tool and I went ahead and crimped on some DuPont connectors so that I can easily remove this later if I want. I followed that up with just a little bit of E6000 glue. This is a glue that can be removed in the future if you need to, but it has a very strong bond. These DuPont connections have a tendency to slip out, so I like to put a little bit of glue on them, just a little bit, to keep them in place until I do need to disconnect them if I do in the future. As I've been working on this, I've noticed that the case is actually really dirty. So I think the last thing I want to do before I call it a day is go ahead and give this case a nice soapy bath in the sink. And after letting it set out in the sun for a little bit and bringing it back inside, you can really see the difference. This thing almost looks brand new. So I'm really glad I took the time to get that out of the way while I had the case disassembled. Once everything was put back together, I wanted to do just one final test just to make sure I didn't crimp any wires, make sure everything was working the way I expected it to, and yep, sure enough, right on cue. Hit the TV type switch and pause is enabled. I can't think of a better excuse to open up this vintage Dymo Woodgrain labeling tape and create an old school plastic label to put over this TV type switch. So now I know that this is now the pause switch. So this matches the Woodgrain on the Atari 2600 exactly. And I've never been happier in all my life to put a label on something like this. This just really brings back memories, and I will forever know that this has been modified to pause any Atari game. Really cool. So the pause mod is working on my light sixer sitting over there on the bench. I'm not going to be modding my heavy sixer. I'm going to keep that stock, but yeah, it's actually working. So if I was playing Enduro on that, I would actually finally be able to hit the pause button, go to the John, do my business, whatever I needed to do. Maybe now that I'm a little bit older, take that important phone call, of course. For me, probably more likely it would be that I was starting to fall asleep as I was playing and needed to pause it and maybe come back the next day or after I've had a nap. That's the pause mod. And on the next video, I'm going to be showing you how you can install a stereo mod. I'm using quotes on that one because we'll take a look and see if it actually is true stereo or not. But as I mentioned in the 10 technical things video, there is a way actually to get multiple sounds out of the Atari 2600 on different channels. So we'll take a look at that next time. I also want to thank my patrons. I really appreciate your support. If you want to become a patron, you can check the link down below. I also have a whole series of Atari videos that I've done. And so what I'll do is I'll put a playlist on the screen. You can click on that video and I'll see you over there in the next one.
End of line.